here with all of you. I'll speak briefly on Africa and then briefly on Zimbabwe. I think the self-evident fact is that Africa coped well from the global economic crisis, even though we didn't escape the secondary effects of the crisis. And I think that we are recovering fairly well. If you look at the modest growth rates of around 2.9% in 2009, and the current growth rates, which are on average around 4%, 4.5%. And I think at the epicenter of Africa's capacity to do well is what I would call a newfound energy in African economies, which energy is inextricably connected to the increased democratization on the African continent, a reduction in the number of conflicts, a reduction in the number of fragile states, and a general improvement in Africa's democracy balance sheet in recent years. If you look at the region where some of us come from, Southern African region, you see political and democratic stability in a country like Mozambique, Zambia, Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho, and that has also had a multiplier effect on the growth rates of these countries. So clearly you see evidence of a connection between growth rates, economic stability, macroeconomic sanity, with constitutionalism, respect of the rule of law and institutions, which questions or puts to the center what is happening in North Africa at the present moment, what is happening in Ivory Coast. And I think the answer there is that we need to build strong institutions that are subordinated to the people, and that no executive, no government can escape the legitimacy of the will of the people. But I think the long-term solution to Africa's challenges lies in the following factors. One, the issue of democracy, the issue of constitutionalism, the issue of the rule of law, the issue of having regular elections, the issue of respecting the people's will. Secondly, continuing the newly found energy in a macroeconomic stability, prudent macroeconomic management. Thirdly, I think Africa has to pursue seriously the issue of regional integration that Tim has spoken of. Africa has got a population of more than 1 billion people. It has got thousands of towns that have got a population of 1 million and above. So it will be very easy for Africa to actually integrate. Compare China, we've got everything that China has in terms of population, the market, and these towns that can actually be integrated to reap economies of scale. The fourth thing, I think, is technology. ICTs represent a future enabler and champion for Africa's development. We need to embrace the issue of ICTs in our economy. The fourth thing, I think, is the development and articulation of an alternative development model, an alternative accumulation model for Africa. Most of our economies are mono economies. We either depend on agriculture or we depend on mining. There's no processing, there is no tertiary and secondary industries. Ghana and the Ivory Coast produce cocoa, but the largest manufacturers of cocoa, the Cadburys of this world, are not found on the African continent. Zimbabwe and South Africa are major producers of platinum, but you will not find a platinum processing plant in Zimbabwe, for instance. So we need to find an alternative, accumulation model. And lastly, we have to deal with the issue of development. And development deals with two issues. First is Africa's lagging infrastructure. in terms of power, in terms of roads, in terms of water, and so forth. Then social delivery, our levels of education, our health facilities, and so forth. It's still a long way to go. And I think the debate we should be starting now, instead of waiting a few years later, is what will succeed the MDGs, for instance, because MDGs are not a panacea to Africa's problems. Most of us are non-compliant anyway. On Zimbabwe, many of you are aware of the fact that we had a crisis a political crisis for at least 13 years. The net effect of that crisis was that our economy between 1997 and 2008 lost 60% of its value. Capacity utilization slumped from 80%, 90% to low levels of 2% to 10%. Unemployment, 85% of our population was unemployed. 85% of the people were living below the poverty datum line, surviving on less than 35 cents in a day. Macroeconomic stability went through the window. Inflation, for instance, at the last time we counted it, in July of 2008, was 231 million%. When the IMF, in their first Article 4 mission, visited Zimbabwe in March of 2009, they put our inflation at 500 billion%. We printed a $100 trillion note that couldn't buy you 2 bottles of soda. So that was the status quo and balance sheet as of the 31st of December 2008. A global political agreement was signed on the 15th of September 2008, which allowed the formation of a coalition government that started work on the 16th of February 2009. This coalition government came up with a blueprint called STEP, the Short-Term Emergency Recovery Program, which document basically dealt with the issue of macroeconomic stabilization, the issue of supply-side recovery, the issue of social delivery and safety nets, and most importantly, the issue of democracy, constitutionalism, the rule of law, the reform of the media, the reform of state institutions. In the first year of STEP, we saw inflation being reduced to -7.7%, and we saw the country having a growth rate of 5.5% for the first time in 13 years. So there's been some level of macroeconomic stability, but challenges and serious challenges still exist. The first challenge we still have is politics. Politics still continues to hold hostage the economy. There are issues around the fragility and health of the global political agreement. Recently, Southern African Development Cooperation leaders met in Livingstone, Zambia, and insisted that Zimbabwean parties should come up with a roadmap towards an uncontested, free and fair election. And I'm pleased to advise that the negotiators of the major political parties in Zimbabwe started working on this roadmap. The second structural thing that we are facing is the issue of debt. Zimbabwe has got unvalidated debt of $7.1 billion. So we have to go through the traditional methods of debt resolution, what is kept your country team, and we've started working on that. We are in the process of negotiating a staff monitor program with the IMF at the present moment, and there are 1 or 2 markers that we have to cross. The third issue is the issue of infrastructure. I've already mentioned the infrastructural deficit on the African continent in general, but let me mention the status briefly, the state of infrastructure in Zimbabwe. If you take power, for instance, the country's requirements are anything between 2,500 megawatts to 3,000 megawatts. We've been producing anything between 400 to 700 megawatts. So the country is a victim of and a prisoner of power cuts and blackouts. Each one of our towns needs a rehabilitation of its water and sanitation system, and some of you will recall that as recent as 2008 with the major cholera outbreak in Zimbabwe. The state of our roads is chaotic, and with respect to a few African countries that I won't name, we've become the pothole capital of the African continent. So we need to spend money on our roads, our railway infrastructure, and so forth. The fourth challenge is social delivery. How do we uplift and rehabilitate our education system? For a long time, Zimbabwe is the second highest literacy rate after Tunisia on the African continent, and we have lost a lot of that. We need to rehabilitate our universities, our institutions of higher learning, and so forth. The last thing, which is a challenge, is I think capacity. We need to rebuild capacity. Wherever you have a situation of conflict and failure, you lose your manpower, you lose your capacity. So we would like to rehabilitate capacity. The future might look bleak in the short term, but I have no doubt that like the future of Africa in general, I think Zimbabwe is on its way up, just like Africa is on its way up. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Biti. Now we